Well, Jon Steingard was the singer for a awesome Christian band called Hawk Nelson, and he has since renounced his Christianity. He has deconstructed, and I wanted to take a look at some comments that Jon made in a conversation with my friend Jonathan McLatchie, which I think really sums up kind of a lot of what most of us have been feeling, and I think it's the real reason why Jon Steingard has walked away from his faith.
How much of this is systemic to the belief and how much of it is an improper usage?
Well, welcome back, doubters, to Dealing with Deconstruction. This is a safe place where I hope that we can continue to have the conversation around these big, huge, giant questions that a lot of us have about our Christian faith. Can we hold on to our Christian faith? Can we pull the pieces apart, examine each one individually, and see if they are true? And truth is our cornerstone, as I like to say. I do want to invite you to our Facebook group, our Dealing with Deconstruction Facebook group. If you are on this journey where you're looking at the individual pieces of your faith, if you're asking these really big questions, that is a great place for you to plug in and ask some questions. My goal with the Facebook group and with these videos is not necessarily to convince you of anything. It's just want it to be one piece of your journey, one thing to think about as you continue to look at some of the different pieces of Christianity and examine them to see, does this really fit, or how does this fit in? And one of the things that we're going to look at today is these comments from Jon Steingard. Now, before I get into this video, I do want to say that I think Jon and I are very similar in a lot of ways. Jon and I are both musicians. We both, kind of have the cool hair. We would much rather seems to be on stage. And I think from my viewings of conversations that Jon has done, particularly this one with Jonathan McLatchie, and you can find the link to this full conversation that he had with Jonathan McLatchie in the comments there. I think that both Jon and I come at things similarly, at least initially. We're both kind of right-brained, we're both brained, we're both creative in that sense, and we tend to kind of, and Jon even admits this, look at things a little bit more with the intuitive sense of things than kind of the structural, logical sense of things. I do want to mention before we get too far that if you are deconstructing your Christian faith, or if you know someone that is deconstructing their Christian faith and you want to be able to walk with them, I would encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Also, if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and hit that little thumbs up. We really appreciate that. It helps us get the word out. You could also share this with your network. It would be really appreciated. I want to get into what Jon says here, and I just want to listen to this short clip, and then I want to give some thoughts. So let's go ahead and just watch this clip together.
Like, if you're going to believe in Christianity and the resurrection, like, I think you'd better be sure, right? Because here's why it matters. It matters because Christianity has been used to treat women as secondary. It's been used to exclude the LGBTQ plus community and fight against their rights. It's been used to create a culture of purity culture that has shamed millions of people around their sexuality and their self-identity. It's been used to talk about a doctrine of hell that's traumatic for many, many, many people. And I know many people that have had to do serious therapy because of the trauma they experienced being taught about hell. It's been used to teach original sin, which I believe is a culture of shame. It's been used for colonialism, for manifest destiny, for the Crusades, the Salem witch trials, affirmation of slavery. Like, it's been used for all these things. So if we're gonna believe this, like, we need to be sure. And I would just say, like, in light of all that stuff, that's why this question matters so much, right?
Sure.
And I know you believe this question matters too. So I'm not.
Yeah. Of course. And of course, whether Christianity has been used to justify these things is a different matter from whether it should be used to justify these things.
I agree with that. But what I would say is that, like, when something has been used as a weapon a lot, it's worth being critical of and going, like, is this systemic? How much of this is systemic to the belief and how much of it is an improper usage?
Now, I think the first thing that we need to do after hearing that is just kind of sit in it for just a second. Let's just take in what Jon is saying there, because I think it's really, really, really important. And I think it sums up how a lot of us feel as we look back across the canvas of history and are trying to do our best to evaluate things today. So let's just take a second and just think about some of that. As I thought through how to respond to this video, and I have pored over this clip, I've watched this clip several times and thought through the best way to respond to some of this, because I think it deserves a response. And I think Jon is genuinely asking these things. I think this is a real specific issue for him. In fact, I think it's the issue for him. I think when he looks at Christianity, he says, there is this common thread of Jesus tied to all of these injustices, all of these wrongs over the course of history, the mistreatment and oppression of women and LGBTQ people, their denial of rights, and all of these other things, slavery and colonization and all these other things. He says, man, how can there be this thread of Jesus through each one of these things? And that raises the bar that I need to have if you're going to convince me that Jesus walked out of the grave, that Christianity is true. And on one level, I thought, man, I could just go through this video and we could talk about each one of those pieces, each one of that list that he gave, and we could try to just debunk each one or give the justification or look at the reasons around them. But honestly, I don't think that would necessarily be helpful. As I thought about this video, I thought, man, what if Jon is just sitting across the table from me at a coffee shop and he, kind of talks about what he just did in that clip? What would be the appropriate response? And I think the first response is to do what we did right after that clip, is just kind of sit in that for just a second. And I think that's really important, is to say, yeah, there was evil and there was injustice and there was oppression all throughout Christian history. And I think the key thing that he says that kind of sums up his whole view there is those last few sentences. Is this part of the view? Do I have to adopt all of these things by saying Jesus walked out of the grave? Or was that a misuse, a mistreatment of the text, or a mistreatment of who Jesus was? And how do I know which one it is? And so as I thought more and more about how to respond to these comments, because I think they are really, really, really important. And I think the first thing that I'd like to bring up is some comments from an author named Tom Holland, who wrote a book called Dominion. Well, he's written several books, but in this short clip that we're going to watch, he is talking about his book Dominion. And I think there's two clips that I kind of put together that are really, really important for us to think about as we are evaluating Jon's issues, as Jon's claims that he kind of says why it's so hard for him to, or why we better be so sure, as he says, that we're right about some of this. And so I think I want to play this clip, and then I want to kind of give some legs to it, and then I got two other pieces that I want to talk about. So let's look at this clip from Tom.
This isn't a myth. This is true. So with Dominion, the most vituperative criticism has tended to come from people who believe in the Enlightenment myth, the idea that it all begins, or humanists who believe that their values are just kind of immanent and not culturally contingent, or can be traced back, that they just exist everywhere. But I think that these are myths, and nobody likes people don't like to be told that their myths are mythical.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that the word woke is a riff on the idea, obviously, on being awakened, and the idea that people fall asleep, that they fall into sin, basically, and therefore need to be woken up from that, and to wake up to the light, to the truth, to liberate themselves from the chains of oppression, is fundamental to the history of Anglo-American Protestantism. There are, cycles of what are called awakenings that ripple through Protestant Britain and Protestant America, and this summons is something that seems to happen kind of, every few generations. And I think it's clear that the civil rights movement was absolutely part of that. That was part of this cycle of awakenings, and it's why it had such an impact in Britain, because it's part of the cultural DNA. having said that, I think that one of the things that's been striking about Black Lives Matter and the way that it's kind of erupted over the course of this summer is that, on the one hand, the Christian dynamics are absolutely evident. Most fundamentally, there is the deep-rooted assumption that those who suffer oppression should be freed, should be liberated. And the narratives that underlie that, most obviously, are the Exodus narrative and the narrative of Christ rising from death and casting off the chains of death. And those were the stories that inspired and motivated Martin Luther King, for instance. And you can see them that they're still fundamental. The influence of those stories remains absolutely manifest. That's why people went out on the streets, because they felt that these were simply true. And again, why did the death of an innocent man put to death by the apparatus of a kind of imperial power have such an impact? Why did somebody crying out, "I can't breathe," have this impact? Well, at the heart of Western civilization, for centuries and centuries and centuries, has existed the figure of someone suffering an unjust death, dying because he couldn't breathe. So the ripples that are set out from these are very, very profound.
Tom covers a lot in that clip, but I think it's important that from his research as a non-Christian historian, looking back at that canvas of history that we've talked about, that Jon is referring to, that it is steeped in this idea of justice and influenced so heavily by Christianity that it cannot be denied. And that's one of the central ideas of Tom's book called Dominion, that there are so many of these ideas that Jon is even referring to, that he is pulling out or that he is using, that need Christianity as their bedrock. So for him to even address some of the issues, and again, they are issues. I think some of the things that he brought up are real problems that Christianity has touched on throughout history. But when we understand that, looking through the looking glass of what is really going on, it's steeped in Christianity. It's steeped in the idea of justice. It's steeped in the idea of an innocent Savior dying and rising again. And the culture that we have, the things that Jon is drawing on, we are owed to Christianity, are because of Christianity, because of Jesus walking out of the grave. And I don't think I've realized that enough. Even though I have understood some of those things kind of from a high level, I think when we're looking at the injustice that we see around us, or even, over the course of history, when we're pulling out these different pieces, it doesn't quite encapsulate this whole entire idea of how much our understanding of our culture is steeped in what Jesus taught. The next piece that I want to give to kind of prop some of this up, to kind of evidence some of this, what I'm talking about, is I want to read a passage from this book called Humilitas by John Dickson. And I think it's another quote that kind of just gives us a little bit of background. One of the things that Jon does in this book, in addition to defining humility, is he talks about this humility revolution that happened around the time of Jesus, and it's traced back to the early church. And so I want to just read a short passage out of this book. But before I do that, I want to give the definition that Jon is using of humility. So let's go ahead and do that right now. I want to give Jon's definition of humility because I think it's really, really important for the rest of this conversation. He defines humility as the noble choice to forgo your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. And so that's the idea that Jon is using in this book as humility. And we see that in the person of Jesus Christ. And then we see that growing over history, throughout history, from the church, from Christians. So even though we can recognize that there have been injustices, we can say that there has been, I think, an outsized influence of Jesus on our culture today that has done far more good than some of these things. And that might tip the scale back when we're looking at some of the evidences. I want to read 2 quick passages from John's book. He says, Jesus' death has, of course, been the subject of enormous theological reflection, the most important being the affirmation that he did die as an atoning sacrifice for the salvation of the world. But that is not our concern here. More important for the current discussion is the way that his first followers of Jesus began to rethink their entire honor-shame paradigm in which they had been raised. As I have said earlier, ancient Mediterranean cultures pursued honor and avoided shame at all cost. Honor was proof of merit. Shame was the proof of worthlessness. But what does this say about the crucified Jesus? That was the question confronting the early Christians. Logically, there were only 2 options. Either Jesus was not as great as they first thought, his crucifixion being evidence of his insignificance, or the notion of greatness itself had to be redefined to fit the fact of his seemingly shameful end. And he goes on to talk about how that first option of them just denying that doesn't work, and then he concludes with this. Christians took the other option. For them, the crucifixion was not evidence of Jesus' humiliation, or humilitas, but proof that greatness can be expressed in humility, humilitas, the noble choice to lower yourself for the sake of others. I think that is the essence of Christianity. And I think we could admit that we fall short every single day in this, that we have made significant mistakes, that I have made significant mistakes, that I can point to people that are in the Christian church as leaders, as over an entire congregation that have not lived out Jesus's model of humility and leadership. And we can look back and say, throughout history, we owe so much of our culture's understanding of humility to the person of Jesus Christ. And that should color the way that we look at the evidence, that we can acknowledge that the oppression and the unjust actions of the thread of Christianity throughout history, but we have to be able to also look at all of the good, all of the things that we owe, the whole essence of rights, the whole essence of being a person that has freedom to be able to choose right and wrong, to be able to govern the way that we do, is owed to Christianity, is owed to the person of Jesus Christ walking out of the grave. The last thing I'll point out is that John Ortberg had another great book called Who Is This Man? And he does something very similar. He kind of walks through history and points to all of these massive cultural changes that are owed to the person of Jesus Christ, that we would not have without Jesus Christ. So I think just to give to put a balance, to put a little bit of weight on the scales of the other side of this issue, and I'm not taking anything away from what John is saying, but I think his real issue to say is this: do all of these beliefs, do I have to take all of these beliefs on if I believe that Jesus walked out of the grave, if God resurrected Jesus? And I think that the answer is no. I think we have to take all of this good that we see around us, all of this understanding of who we are, and the understanding of humility, and the understanding of who Jesus is, that we as the church try to emulate, and particularly just our culture. We're so steeped in Christian culture that we can't even separate some of those things. And I think that's extremely important for us to recognize. There's so much more that I want to say about this. I'm asking that if you have some comments about what John said, or if I missed something that you want to point out, please go ahead and leave it in the comments. Love to read those comments and respond to them. I do want to say that I hope that if John's kind of initial point there is a significant issue for you, that hopefully understanding Tom Holland's point and looking back at John Dixon's understanding of humility and the humility revolution that happened around Jesus and the early church helped give you a little bit of weight to look on the other side to say, I think this evidence needs to be looked at crucially, needs to be understood in context, but that there is so much good that has come out of the Christian worldview in our culture that to just point out the few things. And again, the few, when I say looking at the whole canvas of history where Christians extremely messed up, I think that scale needs to be pointed the other way. And so I hope that helped you look at this. I hope that this helped you understand things a little bit differently in your process of deconstruction. And I hope we can put one more board back in your reconstruction process of Christianity. I'm inviting you to continue to doubt toward faith. We'll see you next time on Dealing with Deconstruction.